At the HOA monthly meeting in the community center, Karen demanded I say congratulations to her pregnant daughter. I stayed silent. Her husband slammed his hand down on the table. I didn't flinch because this time I had the power and the claws and the footage. They thought I'd stay quiet forever. But they forgot who built the compliance systems that protect this neighborhood. They forgot I record everything. They forgot I have friends in legal. This is the story of how they broke me until I broke the silence and took everything they cared about with one email. My name is Claire, and at 34 I had mastered the art of building walls. Not the kind made of brick and mortar, but the invisible, impenetrable fortresses of data and code that powered a $240 million AI-driven financial platform in Minneapolis. I was a data architect, a creator of elegant, logical systems where every input had a predictable output and every action was logged, audited, and accounted for. My professional life was a sanctuary of order. My HOA life was the chaos I had tried and failed to escape. The summons for the monthly meeting had come, as always, via a clipped email from Karen Whitaker, the HOA president. Meeting at 6. Don't be late. It was a command, not an invitation. Driving to the pristine community center in Evergreen Estates, the neighborhood I'd never truly felt was my own. I could feel the familiar coil of dread tightening in my stomach. The neighborhood, purchased with my own money after years of saving, was a monument to their second-chance happiness. It was all polished lawns kept at exactly 3 inches, gleaming rule signs, and oversized community portraits from which my face was conspicuously absent. I was a ghost from a previous life, an inconvenient artifact of a resident who once dared to question the sacred covenant of the HOA charter. I walked into the smell of potluck casseroles and the sound of Greg's booming laughter. He was holding court in the meeting room, a large, fleshy man whose presence seemed to suck all the oxygen out of a room. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem neighborly, but always felt like an assertion of ownership. Claire, good of you to make it. Lena's got some big news for us. Karen, a woman who had become a master of strategic obliviousness, fluttered over and kissed the air near my cheek. You look tired, dear. You work too hard. It was her standard greeting, a subtle dig wrapped in a veneer of concern. And then there was Lena, Karen's daughter, the golden child. She was radiant, practically glowing with self-satisfaction, her hand resting proprietorially on a small, barely their baby bump. She sat on the sofa like a queen upon her throne, soaking in the adoration. Her fiancé Matt, a blandly handsome man whose wealth was his most interesting personality trait, sat beside her, looking vaguely pleased with himself. The meeting was served at the ridiculously long folding table Karen had insisted on setting up, a piece of furniture meant for holiday gatherings of a large happy community they pretended to be. The conversation was a performance. Greg pontificated about a new landscaping contract that somehow always went to his cousin's company. Karen recounted a trivial story about her garden club and how certain residents still hadn't learned that American flags were tacky on non-holiday days. Matt offered monosyllabic affirmations. I ate my casserole, kept my gaze fixed on my plate, and said nothing. Silence was my shield. It was the one territory they could not conquer. Finally, after the plates were cleared and Karen brought out a sheet cake decorated with tiny storks, Lena cleared her throat, a theatrical little sound that demanded immediate silence and attention. Well, she began, beaming at Matt and then at Greg and Karen, pointedly ignoring me. We have something we've been so excited to share with you all. She paused for dramatic effect, placing both hands over her stomach. We're pregnant and Matt and I are officially getting married in the spring. The room erupted. Karen gasped, tears of joy instantly welling in her eyes. Greg bellowed with delight, jumping up to crush Matt in a bear hug before turning to kiss Lena's forehead. That's my girl. That's my little girl. Finally giving me a grandchild. I watched the scene unfold. A perfectly composed tableau of communal bliss. It was a lie. A beautiful, well-rehearsed lie. I felt nothing. Or rather, I felt a familiar cold numbness. The self-preservation mechanism I developed as a resident in this very neighborhood. I thought of a winter afternoon when my lawn was measured at 3 1/10 inches, and I was fined $200 while Lena's oversized RV sat illegally in the guest parking for 6 weeks. The sounds of their laughter muffled through the double-paned windows of the community center. I remembered Greg finding my online complaint about selective enforcement and telling me to be realistic, that my job was to pay the dues quietly, not get ideas above my station. I remembered Lena borrowing my driveway for her moving truck and returning it blocked with a smirk and a shrug. They had spent years teaching me that my feelings, my ambitions, my very presence were an inconvenience. They had succeeded. I felt nothing. Karen, dabbing her eyes with a napkin, finally turned her attention to me. The joy on her face curdled slightly into an expression of stern expectation. The air grew thick and heavy. "Claire," she said, her voice sharp, "did you hear your neighbor? Aren't you going to say anything?" I met her gaze. The silence stretched. The ticking of the community clock in the hall seemed to grow louder with every beat. "Say congrats, Claire," Karen ordered, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. It was the same tone she used when she cited me for questioning the selective enforcement of the no-flag rule. I remained silent. I picked up my water glass, my hand perfectly steady, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I saw Lena's triumphant smile falter, replaced by a flash of petulant anger. I saw Matt's polite confusion, and I saw the storm gathering in Greg's eyes. Bam! His fist came down on the folding table so hard the water glasses jumped and the sheet cake wobbled precariously. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Don't you be disrespectful in my community," he snarled, his face a mottled red. "Your neighbor shares the best news of her life, and you sit there like a stone. What is wrong with you?" The Claire from 10 years ago would have flinched. The Claire from 5 years ago would have stammered out a hollow, forced congratulations just to make it stop. The new resident who was once fined and isolated would have burst into tears. But they weren't looking at that Claire anymore. They were looking at a woman who architected systems designed to detect fraud down to the 100th of a decimal point. A woman who understood that data in its purest form was power. A woman who no longer sought their approval, only their accountability. I didn't flinch. I slowly lowered my glass. My eyes locked on his. The fear was gone, replaced by something cold and hard and liberating because this time I had the power and the claws and the footage. This time I had the data. My handbag sat on the empty chair beside me. Inside it, nestled between my wallet and my phone, was a small, innocuous-looking object, a black Kingston flash drive. Felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. On that tiny sliver of plastic and metal was Greg's entire world. Not his personal world of fake community meetings and performative joy, but the world he actually cared about, his HOA treasurer role. It contained copies of every file he'd foolishly asked me to clean up for him a few months ago. The backdated fine spreadsheets designed to cheat residents out of refunds, the fraudulent invoices from shell corporations, the carefully documented proof of insurance and tax evasion, the email chains where he explicitly instructed the bookkeeper to cook the books. He thought I was just his wife's quiet, resentful neighbor, good with computers, but ultimately powerless. He and Karen and Lena had made a critical miscalculation. They had spent a lifetime treating me as if I were invisible. And in doing so, they had failed to see what I had become. They saw a stone. They were about to find out it was a goddamn wrecking ball. I held Greg's furious gaze. The silence in the room now my weapon, not my shield. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips. Greg's rage was a physical force, a wave of heat and noise that washed over the folding tables. But as I sat there bathed in his fury, I wasn't in that room anymore. His outburst was a key, unlocking a door to a long, cold hallway of memories I had spent my adult life trying to seal shut. In my mind, I was the new resident again, watching Karen, radiant in her pastel blazer, preside over her first board meeting like a queen crowning herself. That was the day I began to fade. Before the Whitakers, the neighborhood had been just another suburban grid. When they arrived, they brought with them Lena and the gravitational pull of their community standards. I was knocked out of orbit, relegated to the cold, dark edges of the new HOA system they were building. My backyard, once a quiet sanctuary, was cited for excessive foliage because Lena wanted her view unobstructed. My things were moved, metaphorically, to the small print of every rulebook. A space that felt more like storage than a sanctuary. Invisibility became my new uniform. Conversations would halt when I entered a room, resuming only after I had passed through, as if my presence was a momentary interruption, like a commercial break. Board decisions were made without my input. Pool parties were planned around Lena's schedule. Weekend activities were dictated by her social calendar. I was an afterthought, a logistical problem to be managed with citations. The chores became my designated role. While Lena was praised for her lovely holiday decorations that violated 3 separate rules, I was tasked with paying extra assessments. My hands chapped from writing checks as I listened to their laughter from the community center. It wasn't just about money. It was about occupation. Keep Claire busy. Keep Claire out of the way. My studies and career were my only escape. A secret world they couldn't touch. I'd finish my remote work and retreat to my home office, diving into the clean, predictable logic of code and databases. It was a world of rules and order where a correct answer was always correct, regardless of who you were. But even that was a battle. "Stop hiding behind your computer," Claire, Greg would say, his voice thick with disapproval at the annual meeting. "Go outside. Help the community." A good neighbor doesn't need all that in her head. He wasn't just discouraging me. He was trying to define the boundaries of my world, to keep me small and contained within the role he had assigned me, the compliant payer. The memory that the sheet cake and rage meeting had resurrected most vividly was from the winter I first moved in. It had been a stupid, childish argument with Lena over my parking spot she had taken and blocked with her moving truck. Her version, screamed through performative tears to the board, was that I had attacked the harmony of the neighborhood. I hadn't laid a finger on anything, but in the court of the HOA, I was always guilty. Greg, without asking for my side, had the board slap a $300 fine on me and ban me from the pool for a month. "You need to cool off and think about your attitude," he'd grunted, posting the violation notice on my door. The lock on the community gate clicked shut behind me for 30 days. First, I was just angry, pacing back and forth, my breath pluming in the frigid Minneapolis air. But as minutes turned into weeks, the anger froze and cracked, replaced by a chilling clarity. Through the large glass windows of the community center, I could see them. The 3 of them were sitting at the head table eating catered food, the warm light from the building spilling onto the snow around me. They were laughing. Karen glanced at my empty chair once, her expression unreadable, before turning back to something Greg said. They hadn't just punished me. They had forgotten me. I was outside, literally in the cold, and the picture of their community was complete, perfect, and utterly undisturbed by my absence. That was the moment I understood. I wasn't part of the neighborhood. I was a feature of the HOA, and a faulty one at that. When the cold had seeped so deep into my bones that I couldn't stop shaking, Karen finally emailed me. "You can attend again now," she'd said, not with concern, but with the weary tone of someone dealing with a misbehaving pet. "Try to get along with your neighbors." That night, shivering under my blankets, I made a promise to myself. I would get out. My rebellion wouldn't be loud or confrontational. It would be silent, diligent, and absolute. The library and my home office became my true home. I studied with a ferocity born of desperation, hiding my advanced certifications under my mattress. I taught myself the basics of compliance coding from online courses, the structured logic of programming a bomb to the chaotic injustice of HOA life. Every promotion at work, every academic award I hid from them was a brick in the foundation of my escape route. I applied for better roles in secret, writing my resumes at the coffee shop and using a P.O. box for the mail. When the acceptance letter and a lead architect position arrived at my company, I simply updated my HOA profile one August morning and told no one. There was no celebration, no proud farewell. There was only Karen's bewildered, slightly wounded email. But who will help with the community portal? Work and the years after were a blur of relentless focus. I put myself through advanced certifications while working overtime. I entered a field dominated by men and didn't just survive. I thrived. I loved the pristine architecture of a well-designed database, the challenge of building algorithms that could sift through mountains of chaotic information and find elegant, actionable patterns. I built systems. I created order from chaos at my company. I was respected. My opinion was sought after. My designs were implemented. I was the lead architect on a new AI compliance platform that managed and audited financial transactions worth over $240 million. I was visible. I was essential. But to the HOA board, I was still the resident who should be paying extra without complaint. My achievements were abstract, meaningless concepts to them. When I emailed Karen that I'd been promoted to lead architect, she'd replied in 30 seconds. "That's nice, dear. Listen, Lena's wedding planning needs a little help with the venue deposit. And she's a little short. You're doing so well. Could you maybe?" I had quietly archived the email. They didn't see my success as something to be proud of. They saw it as a resource to be tapped for Lena's benefit to them. I wasn't a data architect. I was an ATM, an ungrateful one at that because I so often said no. I was the strange cold resident who didn't understand that the entire purpose of her life was to be a supporting character in the grand story of Lena, the beloved princess. Standing there in that meeting room with Greg's fist still planted on the table and Karen's disappointment radiating towards me. All those years of being diminished, of being erased, coalesced into a single point of cold, hard resolve. They still saw the new resident they could fine into submission. They were about to meet the 34-year-old woman who had built the system, owned the logs, and held the key to everything. The flash drive in my purse didn't just materialize out of thin air. The seeds of the board's destruction were sown 3 months before that fateful meeting, planted by Greg's own arrogance and technical incompetence. It happened on a Tuesday evening. I was working late from my home office, deep in the process of stress testing a new predictive algorithm when my phone buzzed with a call from Karen. "Claire, honey, your neighbor needs a little help," she began, using the term neighbor which always grated on me. He was not and never would be. "I'm in the middle of a deployment, Karen. Can it wait?" "Oh, it won't take a minute for you," she chirped, oblivious as always to the complexities of my career. "He's just having some trouble with the HOA spreadsheets, for the quarterly review. He'd be so grateful." Gratitude from Greg was a foreign concept. But I knew what this was. It was a royal summons, and refusing it would lead to a month of passive-aggressive violation notices from Karen about my unwillingness to be part of the community. The path of least resistance, as it so often was to acquiesce. "Fine, Isite," closing the active terminal on my screen. "Send him over." An hour later, Greg was standing in the middle of my minimalist home office, looking entirely out of place, like a bulldog in a Zen garden. He was holding a laptop and had a condescendingly paternal smile plastered on his face. "Thanks for this, Claire," he boomed, his voice too loud for the space. "My bookkeeper is on vacation, and I've got to get these numbers sorted for our quarterly review. Just a few Excel files that need, tidying up. You're the computer whiz. Shouldn't take you long." He handed me a USB drive, a cheap plastic one with the HOA logo printed on it. The casualness of the act was staggering. He was handing a data architect, a woman whose entire career was built on finding anomalies in complex systems, the keys to the kingdom, and he did it with the same thoughtless ease as asking someone to pass the salt. "What exactly needs tidying up?" I asked, my voice flat. Make it all look professional. Check the formulas. Make sure the totals add up. Simple stuff." I took the drive. "I'll look at it when I have time." Later that night, after the pressure of my own work had subsided, I plugged his drive into my system. What I found was not a few tidy spreadsheets. It was a digital dumpster fire, a chaotic mess of poorly named files, inconsistent formats, and a complete lack of any logical structure. Finds June 2024, XLSX. Finds July FINL, XLS. Landscaping Q3 draft.doc. My professional instincts recoiled. No legitimate HOA operated with this level of systemic sloppiness. My first step was to write a simple script to parse, rename, and standardize the files into a clean directory structure. It was an automatic, almost unconscious action, the way a chef sharpens their knives before starting to cook. As the script ran, organizing chaos into order, the patterns began to emerge, and they were ugly. The first red flag was in the find files. I opened the file for July. The dates listed for weekly assessments were all correct, falling on consecutive Fridays. But a quick check of the file's metadata told a different story. The XLSX file itself hadn't been created until mid-September. The modification history showed it had been altered dozens of times in a single afternoon. This wasn't a record of fines issued. It was a retroactive fabrication. He was backdating assessments to residents to secure emergency loans or fool auditors. The reasons were varied, but they were all illegal. Curiosity, cold and professional, took over. I dug deeper. I cross-referenced the resident lists with files labeled vendor contracts. I found what I expected. A core group of board favorites were listed with proper refunds and credits. But the vast majority of regular homeowners were all classified as delinquent payers with no recourse. This was a classic textbook scheme. By backdating and misclassifying, Greg avoided paying out legitimate refunds.
Dudja propea kunting.
And most critically, pocketed the difference into shell accounts. One serious complaint, and the homeowner would discover he had no appeal process. Greg was building the board's power on the backs of unprotected residents, pocketing the difference. The anger began as a low, cold hum in my chest. I thought of the neighbors I'd seen at meetings, men and women with tired faces, working regular jobs in a dangerous economy with no safety net. Also, Greg could afford his oversized truck and Lena could have a lavish wedding. The final piece of the puzzle was in the invoices. There were dozens of payments made out to vendors I'd never heard of. Apex Lawn Services, Keystone Maintenance LLC. When I ran a search on them, I found nothing. No websites. No business registrations. No physical addresses. The addresses listed on the invoices themselves were either P.O. boxes or vacant lots on the industrial edge of town. These were shell corporations. He was paying himself, creating fraudulent expenses to slash the HOA's declared profits and cheat the state and federal government out of hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes. It was all there. A trifecta of corporate fraud, backdating, resident misclassification, and tax evasion through sham invoices. It was sloppy, brazen, and utterly damning. The next day, I approached it carefully. I drove to the Whitaker's house where Karen and Greg were in the kitchen. I kept my tone neutral, framing my questions as a professional offering advice. I looked at those files. Greg, I said, leaning against the counter. There are some inconsistencies. The metadata on the fine files shows they were created months after the assessment periods, and the way you're classifying residents could expose the board to a significant fine from the state HOA regulator if you get audited. It's a major compliance risk. Greg's face darkened. He opened his mouth to speak, but Karen cut him off. Her back was to me as she washed vegetables in the sink, but her voice was like ice. Claire, what did we ask you to do? I was taken aback. You asked me to check the files. We asked you to tidy up, she said, turning around, her hands dripping water onto the floor. Her face was a mask of cold fury. Not to investigate, not to audit. Greg runs a successful board. He knows what he's doing. It is not your place to question him. Karen, this is serious. This isn't just messy bookkeeping. This is... Stop, she commanded. Just stop right there. Don't go digging into board business. You either help or you stay out of it. This is how he provides for the community, for Lena, for this neighborhood. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Board business. The implication was clear. The law, ethics, the well-being of residents. None of it mattered. All that mattered was protecting the board's income stream. And I was, as always, on the outside. My concern wasn't seen as helpful. It was seen as a threat, an attack.
I stared here.
At this woman who chose her husband's corruption over her own neighborhood's integrity without a moment's hesitation. The low hum of anger in my chest solidified into something dense and heavy. Fine, I said, my voice devoid of all emotion. I'll finish tidying up. I didn't say another word. I went back to my house. I took out my own encrypted, high-capacity solid-state drive, the one I used for personal archival. I plugged Greg's cheap plastic USB into my machine alongside it, and with a few clicks, I initiated a transfer. I copied everything. Every spreadsheet, every Word document, every doctored invoice. I ran a recovery program on the drive and pulled up deleted file fragments, copying those too. I created a perfect bit-for-bit image of his entire sordid enterprise. As the progress bar crept across my screen, I felt a strange sense of calm. I had no plan. Revenge wasn't even a conscious thought in my mind yet. But I knew with the absolute certainty of a system architect who has just identified a critical vulnerability that I was holding on to something powerful. I was archiving the truth. It was a purely defensive measure, a dead man's switch. Data was my world. And in my world, you never ever delete the logs. You never know when you might need them to prove what really happened. The monthly meeting debacle was followed by 2 weeks of pointed silence. No calls, no texts. It was a familiar punishment, a cold shoulder designed to make me feel the full weight of my transgression. I was meant to stew in my isolation, realize my error, and come crawling back with a hollow apology. In the past, it might have worked. Now, the silence was a gift. It gave me time to think, to work, to exist without the constant low-level hum of their disapproval. The truce, as it were, was broken by an e-veet that landed in my inbox with a digital thud. The subject line, in a swirling, glittery font, read, "Celebrate Lena and Matt's engagement." It was for a block party at the community center the following Saturday, an official coming together of the family. My attendance was not optional. Karen followed up the invite with a text message that simply said, 8 p.m. Be there. Don't embarrass me. I arrived at precisely 8:15 p.m. Late enough to have missed the initial greetings, but early enough to fulfill my obligation. The center was transformed. Caterers bustled in the kitchen. A bartender served champagne by the back door, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and Greg's self-congratulation. He was in his element, holding Matt's father, a stiff, silver-haired man named Mr. Harrison, in a conversational hostage situation, pontificating about property values. I was, as expected, a ghost at the feast. I floated through the rooms, a glass of sparkling water in my hand, a fixed, neutral smile on my face. The performance of being Claire, the quiet and vaguely disappointing resident, was one I could do in my sleep. The assaults were subtle, a series of paper cuts delivered with a smile. All by yourself tonight, Claire? A great aunt asked, her eyes scanning the room for a non-existent date. Don't you worry, a smart girl like you will find someone eventually. Men are just intimidated by a career. Karen, passing by with a tray of canapes, squeezed my arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. Try to mingle, dear, she hissed under her breath. Mrs. Harrison asked who you were. It's a bad look, standing in a corner alone. The worst came from Mrs. Harrison herself. She was a woman carved from ice, draped in pearls and judgment. She cornered me by the fireplace. So, you're the other resident, she said, her tone making it sound like a pre-existing condition. Lena is just a delight, so full of life. You work with computers, is it? I'm a data architect, I said. How fascinating, she replied with an expression that suggested it was anything but. It must be so difficult to find the time for a social life, but you mustn't give up. No woman wants to end up alone with her career. Each comment was a small familiar sting, a reminder of the narrow box they believed I should occupy. Wife, mother, or failing that, pitiable spinster. My actual life, my accomplishments, my meticulously constructed world of logic and success was entirely invisible to them. They looked at me and saw only a void where a husband and children were supposed to be. The main event came halfway through the evening. Lena, who had been holding court like a modern-day Marie Antoinette, gestured for me to follow her to the board office. It was Greg's sanctuary, all dark wood, leather, and framed photos of his community projects. She closed the door, her bubbly party demeanor vanishing, replaced by an expression of conspiratorial urgency. Okay, so I need to ask you a huge favor, she began, her voice a theatrical whisper, and you have to say yes. It's for the wedding. I waited, my expression unreadable. So Matt and I found the perfect venue. It's this incredible historic estate, but they book up like 2 years in advance. And we have to put down a massive deposit like now to hold our date for next spring. I continued to wait. The silence made her fidget. The thing is, she continued, waving a dismissive hand, Matt's big yearly bonus isn't paid out for another 2 months, and Dad has a lot of cash tied up in a new development right now. So, we're just getting a small bridge loan to cover the deposit. Super simple. The bank has already pre-approved it. I knew exactly where this was going. The cold dread in my stomach was now mixed with a sense of weary inevitability. There's just one tiny little snag, she said, forcing a bright winning smile. Because it's a short-term loan, and my income is technically pretty low. The bank wants a cosigner with a strong credit history and a high income verification. And well, she looked at me expectantly. That's you. It's just a formality, really. Just signing a piece of paper. We'll pay it all back the second Matt's bonus hits. It won't cost you a thing. She looked at me, her eyes wide, with the unshakable certainty of someone who has never been denied anything of consequence in her life. She saw this not as a favor, but as my duty. I was the financially stable, unmarried resident. This was my function. This was what I was for. I took a slow breath. I thought of the fraudulent fines, the shell corporations, the lives built on a foundation of lies. This loan wasn't about a wedding venue. It was about propping up a fantasy, and she wanted me to mortgage my hard-earned security to do it. No, I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a slammed door. Lena blinked. What? What do you mean no? I mean,
No.
Lena, I have a strict personal and professional policy against co-signing loans for anyone for any reason. It's not a sound financial decision. I delivered the lines calmly, as if explaining a technical specification. Her face crumpled. The entitled princess dissolved, replaced by a petulant child. A sound financial decision. This is my wedding. This is my happiness we're talking about. I can't believe you're being so selfish. It's just a signature. A signature on a legal document is a binding contract. Lena, it makes me equally liable for the full amount of the debt. Oh my God, you sound like a robot, she shrieked, her voice rising. I knew it. You're jealous. You're jealous that I'm getting married and having a baby and you have nothing. She didn't wait for a response. She threw the door open and stormed out of the office, tears already streaming down her face. A moment later, the storm broke. Karen and Greg appeared in the doorway, their faces thunderous. Lena was sobbing in Karen's arms, pointing a trembling finger at me. What did you do? Karen demanded, her voice shaking with rage. She won't help me, Lena wailed. She's trying to ruin everything. Lena asked me to co-sign a loan, I stated calmly. I declined. Greg stepped forward, his bulk filling the doorway. His face was flushed with anger and champagne. Declined. Your neighbor asks you for one simple thing, one piece of help to make her wedding dreams come true, and you say no after everything we've done for the community. Everything you've done for me. The thought was a bitter laugh in my mind. The years of neglect, of being treated like a servant, of having my ambition belittled. That was what they'd done for me. It's not a simple thing, Greg. It's a significant financial risk. It's community, he roared, attracting the attention of several guests who were now peering nervously toward the office. But you wouldn't know anything about that, would you? You've always been like this, cold, selfish. You can't stand to see your neighbor happy. Karen disentangled herself from Lena and advanced on me. Her eyes, usually masters of polite evasion, were now filled with a raw, ugly venom. I knew you'd do this, she whispered, her voice trembling. You've always resented her. You're a saboteur, Claire. You get some kind of sick pleasure out of spoiling things for everyone else. You're trying to destroy your neighbor's happiness. Saboteur. The word hit me, not because it hurt, but because of its perfect, stunning hypocrisy. They stood there, a board whose entire lifestyle was funded by fraud and deceit, calling me a saboteur for refusing to participate in their next reckless charade. I looked at their three faces, Lena's twisted with tearful indignation, Greg's with belligerent fury, and Karen's with bitter disappointment. In that moment, the last lingering shred of hope that they might one day see me, that they might one day value me, finally died. It wasn't a painful death. It was a quiet, clean severance, like cutting a corrupted data line from a server. I didn't say another word. I picked up my clutch from the desk, walked past them, and out of the office. I could feel the stares of the party guests on my back. I could hear Greg's voice bellowing. That's right. Walk away just like you always do. I didn't stop. I walked out the front door into the cool night air and didn't look back. The party, the board, their whole glittering, fraudulent world, I was leaving it all behind me. In the quiet of my car, I rested my hands on the steering wheel and for the first time I let myself think, really think, about the data sitting on the encrypted drive in my house. It was no longer just a defensive measure. It was a tool, and they had just taught me exactly how to use it. The fallout from the engagement party was a deafening silence that lasted exactly 4 days. On the 5th day, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Karen's name. I let it ring twice, took a deep, steadying breath, and answered. I said nothing. "Claire," she said. Her voice was flat, rehearsed. All the theatrical rage from the party was gone, replaced by something far colder, far more final. "I'm calling to make things clear. After your disgraceful behavior on Saturday, and the stress you've caused your neighbor in her delicate condition, we've made a decision." I waited, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in my quiet house. "Lena is going to need more support now. She and Matt will need space to build their new family. Greg and I feel that it's best if you keep your distance for a while, permanently. From now on, you don't need to come back," she stated. Each word a perfectly polished stone dropped into a deep well. "This neighborhood is for Lena now." I didn't fight. I didn't argue. What was the point? You can't reason with a belief system. Her loyalty was a closed loop, an algorithm with a single immutable rule. Lena first, Greg second, and me, a distant, forgotten variable that had finally been written out of the equation. "I understand," I said. It was the only thing left to say. "Good," she replied, and the line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear and set it on the granite countertop. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I felt light. The heavy, invisible chain of obligation that had tethered me to that neighborhood and its inhabitants for years had finally been severed. I was untethered. I was free. And in that freedom, my mind, which had been compartmentalizing their toxicity for decades, finally integrated the data. All the pieces were there. Greg's brazen fraud, Karen's willing complicity, Lena's bottomless, weaponized entitlement. They operated as a single corrupt entity, a system built to protect itself and expand its holdings at any cost, ethical or legal. Karen's words echoed in my head. This is how he provides for the community. It wasn't a defense. It was an admission. They knew. They all knew. I walked over to my workstation, my footsteps silent on the polished concrete floor of my home office. For months, the data I'd copied from Greg's drive had been a dormant secret, personal insurance policy. But my banishment had changed its nature. His corruption was no longer just a neighborhood matter. It had resulted in my complete dispossession. This new clarity gave rise to a new chillingly logical question. The system he'd built was corrupt. But was it contained? Or were there vulnerabilities? Were there connections I hadn't seen? My professional mind took over. I sat in my ergonomic chair and logged into my company's network through a secure VPN. As a lead architect of the platform, I had Tier 1 administrative access. I could see the entire circulatory system of the financial world. We serviced the transactions, the client portfolios, the compliance checks. I wasn't looking for revenge anymore. I was a systems analyst looking for a breach. Greg was small-time, a local HOA treasurer. My company dealt with global players, hedge funds with billion-dollar portfolios. The odds of an overlap were infinitesimal, but arrogance and greed often create patterns. Criminals, whether they're stealing office supplies or millions of dollars, are lazy. They reuse methods, names, and entities. I wasn't going to search for Greg. That would be clumsy. And every high-level query on our system was logged. Instead, I started with the artifacts of his fraud, the shell corporations. I opened the encrypted container on my local server where I kept his files and pulled the list. Apex Lawn Services, Keystone Maintenance LLC, Northern Ridge Holdings. I started with a simple broad query across our vendor payment database. It was a repository of all third-party payments made by our clients. I searched for the corporate names. Search vendor payments where vendor name in Apex Lawn Services, Keystone Maintenance LLC, Northern Ridge Holdings. Results returned. Nothing. As expected, it was too direct. Greg was cheating the government, not the multi-billion-dollar funds that were our clients. They wouldn't have him on their direct payroll. I needed to think laterally. The money from his fraud had to go somewhere. He wasn't just hiding it in a mattress. He was investing it, making it grow. So, where would a man like Greg invest his dirty money? He'd want something that looked legitimate. Real estate, private equity, something that would wash the money clean. I modified my approach. I began to cross-reference the shell company names and their registered tax ID numbers against our clients' investment partner manifests. These were the documents detailing who was investing in our clients' funds. This was a deeper level, a much more complex query that would take time to run. Run deep asset query on client investment ledgers. Parameters ID XX4567 2234. Estimated run time 15 minutes. I sat back, the faint hum of my workstation's cooling fans the only sound in the room. I watched the progress bar inch across the screen. It felt like watching a bomb-diffusing robot at work. This query was a digital scalpel slicing through layers of corporate obfuscation. It was either going to find nothing or it was going to find the cancer. 10 minutes later, pinged. Query complete. One result found. My heart hammered against my ribs. One result. That's all it took. The result wasn't a direct match. It was an associative link. A connection 3 degrees separated. The entity Keystone Maintenance LLC was listed as a contributing partner in a real estate investment group called SJG Properties LLC. SJG Properties in turn was a founding investor in a private equity fund based out of Minneapolis. The name of that fund made the air leave my lungs. Northstar Capital Partners. Northstar was one of our biggest clients. They were a notoriously aggressive fund that used our AI platform for high-frequency trading and portfolio analysis. And I, Claire, was the lead data architect on their account. I had designed their compliance protocols. I had built the very digital walls meant to prevent exactly this kind of entanglement. My hands flew across the keyboard, my movements precise and economical. I pulled up the primary investor filings for Northstar Capital, the master document signed by all initial partners. I ran a simple text search. Find Greg. There he was. Gregory Whitaker. His name, his address, his signature, a sloppy, arrogant scroll on a commitment letter for $250,000. He had used his fraudulent shell company to invest in one of my company's key clients. The violation was catastrophic. It was a conflict of interest so profound, so flagrant, it made my head spin. My company had explicit ironclad rules. No employee could have a financial relationship with a client. Period. But this was worse. A key employee's direct neighbor who was also a known fraudster, known to me at least, was an investor in a client whose data I had privileged access to. It was a landmine of regulatory, legal, and ethical breaches, insider trading, market manipulation. The SEC would have a field day. I leaned back in my chair, staring at Greg's signature on the screen. He had been so stupid, so arrogant. He thought he was clever, hiding his money through a series of corporate cutouts. But he'd left a perfect, beautiful, immutable digital trail. And that trail didn't just lead to his front door. It led directly to mine. He hadn't just committed fraud. He had made me, his invisible, cast-off neighbor, an unwilling accomplice. He had compromised the integrity of the very systems I had dedicated my life to building. Karen had said the neighborhood was for Lena now. She was wrong. With this new data, with this perfect, beautiful, and catastrophic conflict of interest, I was about to repossess the whole damn world. The discovery of Greg's investment in Northstar Capital didn't trigger an explosion of rage. It triggered a state of absolute crystalline focus. It was the same feeling I got just before deploying a critical system patch across the entire network. A calm, adrenaline-fueled certainty where every action was precise, every variable accounted for, and every potential outcome modeled. Emotion was a corrupting influence. This was not about anger. It was about executing a protocol. The system had been breached. The corrupted node had been identified. The only logical next step was to isolate and purge. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of meticulous hermetic preparation. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. I lived on black coffee and the cold, clean energy of purpose. I was no longer a resident or a neighbor. I was an architect, and I was building a cage of their own design using their own materials. My first task was to prepare the package for my company's legal department. This had to be flawless, clinical, and utterly professional. It had to frame me not as a vengeful neighbor, but as a loyal and diligent senior employee, safeguarding the firm from catastrophic risk. I created a new encrypted volume on my server. Into this digital vault, I began to assemble the evidence. First, I wrote a 3-page memo. The language was sterile, stripped of all personal history. It detailed my role as lead architect on the North Star Capital account. It then stated that I had recently, through a channel external to the company, become aware of a potential conflict of interest as defined in Section 4, subsection B of the Employee Handbook. It identified the conflicting party, Gregory Whitaker of Evergreen Estates HOA, and attached his signed investor agreement with North Star Capital. Then, with surgical detachment, referenced my own HR file to establish the neighbor relationship. Next, I compiled the supporting documentation. I took high-resolution timestamped screenshots of the North Star investor ledgers. I created a separate password-protected folder containing a representative sample of the evidence of Greg's financial crimes, framing it as necessary context to demonstrate the high-risk nature of his investment. I included the backdated fines from July, an invoice from the non-existent Apex Lawn Services, and a copy of a 1099 contract for a worker who was clearly a full-time board employee. I was showing them not just the fire, but the mountain of oily rags and gasoline sitting right next to it. I was demonstrating that their client had accepted an investment from a man whose entire operation was a criminal enterprise, a man who was directly related to the architect of their security protocols. I placed all of this into a single compressed AES-256 encrypted file. The password was a 32-character alphanumeric string. On Monday morning at 9:01 a.m., I drafted a new email. My fingers were steady on the keyboard. To legal-compliance@fintechi.com from claire.danvers@fintechi.com. Subject: flagged potential COI breach involving external vendors. Body: to the Office of the General Counsel. Please see attached encrypted file. Password to be provided via separate secure channel. Detailing a potential significant breach of the company's conflict of interest policy involving a primary client, North Star Capital Partners. I have identified a direct neighbor and financial link between myself and an investor in the aforementioned fund, which may represent a serious regulatory and ethical liability for our firm. I am available to discuss this at your earliest convenience. I have secured all relevant data and have ceased all work on the North Star account pending your instructions. Regards, Claire Danvers, Lead Data Architect. I hit send. A small, almost imperceptible click. The first missile was launched. My next target was the state. This was a different operation entirely. This wasn't about subtle corporate liability. This was about blunt force criminal justice. I navigated to the Minnesota Department of Revenue's official whistleblower portal. The web form was drab and bureaucratic, a series of gray boxes and drop-down menus. It was the perfect soulless vessel for the information I was about to upload. I filled out the form identifying myself by name. Anonymity was for the weak. I wanted them to know who did this. I methodically described the nature of the fraud: systematic tax evasion, assessment fraud, and insurance premium avoidance. Where the form asked for evidence, a small Upload Files button appeared. This time, I didn't hold back. I didn't provide a representative sample. I uploaded everything. The complete mirrored image of Greg's drive. All of it. I organized it into clear, damning folders. Backdated fines 2022 to 2025.
Fraudule invoice Shellcore.
Resident misclassification contracts. Deleted emails recovered. I also included a README file, a simple text document in which I, the data architect, provided a step-by-step guide to his crimes. I explained how the metadata proved the backdating. I listed the non-existent addresses for the shell corporations. I highlighted the clauses in the contracts that were illegal. I made the case so simple, so irrefutable that a first-year accounting intern could secure a conviction. I clicked submit. The progress bar filled. A small message appeared on the screen. Your submission has been received. Thank you. The second missile was in the air. For a moment, I sat in the profound silence of my house. The work was done. The logical protocols had been executed. All that remained was the final human piece of the code. The notification. I opened a new browser window and logged into a secure anonymous email service I had created an account for years ago, but never used. The address was a random string of letters and numbers. It had no connection to me. I drafted a new message. To Karen.Whitaker@gmail.com, Greg.Whitaker@evergreenhoa.net, Lena.Whitaker22@yahoo.com. The three of them, a trinity of delusion and decay. The subject line I left blank. Avoid. In the body of the email, I typed 2 sentences, too short, simple strings of text that contained the weight of my entire life. They were the fulfillment of Karen's final order. She had demanded my silence, my absence. I would give it to her. You wanted silence. You'll hear it in court. My cursor blinked over the send button. There was no hesitation, no final pang of regret. The resident who had once cried in a snowy backyard was gone. The woman who sat in this chair understood that some systems are too corrupt to be repaired. They can only be decommissioned. I clicked send. Then I stood up, walked to my kitchen, and for the first time in 3 days, I made myself a cup of tea. The program was running now. All I had to do was wait and watch it compile. The silence that followed my digital salvo was profound, but it was not empty. It was the charged humming silence of a server processing a complex command. I knew with the certainty of an engineer who has just initiated a system-wide purge that the processes were running in the background, invisible but inexorable. The email to my legal department had triggered an immediate automated response. My access to the Northstar account was suspended. Less than an hour later, I received a call from a senior VP in legal, a man I'd only ever seen in company-wide town halls. His voice was a carefully modulated baritone, betraying no emotion. "Claire," he said, "we've received your flag. Thank you for your diligence. Effective immediately, you are on paid administrative leave. A team from outside counsel will be in touch within the week to conduct a full debrief. Until then, do not discuss this matter with anyone. Do not access company systems. Do not contact the client. Is that understood?" "Understood," I replied. It was exactly the protocol I would have designed myself. Isolate the compromised node. Contain the potential damage. The first tremor from the outside world arrived 5 days later. It wasn't a dramatic explosion, but a small, easily missed news item in the business section of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. A local business blog had picked it up. Evergreen Estates HOA project halted amid rumors of financial review. The article was vague, citing anonymous sources about a large community renovation project that had suddenly and inexplicably frozen. Workers had been sent home. Subcontractors hadn't been paid. The official line from Greg's office was, "Temporary cash flow issues." I read the words on my screen and felt a cold, clean satisfaction. It was working. The Department of Revenue wouldn't announce a full-blown investigation immediately. Their first move would be quieter, more lethal. They would have filed an official notice with the HOA's primary business bank. The moment that notice was filed, the bank's risk management algorithm would have kicked in, and every line of credit, every business loan, every asset-backed note the board had would be instantly frozen, pending the outcome of the audit. That one community project wasn't the problem. It was just the first visible crack in a foundation that was about to disintegrate. The freezing of the board's assets meant that the small bridge loan for Lena's wedding venue was no longer a possibility. That money, which was never really there to begin with, was now locked in a vault to which he no longer had the key. I could picture the scene in their house. Greg's blustering, evasive explanations about a temporary bank error. Lena's mounting panic as the deadline for the non-refundable deposit loomed. Karen's frantic attempts to hold their glittering world together with platitudes and denial. The impact on Lena's engagement was swift. Matt and his family were not the type to tolerate temporary cash flow issues. Their world was one of financial certainty and due diligence. A sudden, unexplained inability to produce a loan for a wedding deposit would be a red flag the size of a billboard. Their lawyers would advise caution. Questions would be asked. Vague answers would not suffice. Matt, the blandly handsome prince, would begin to see that the kingdom he was marrying into was built on a swamp. His calls to Lena would become less frequent. His tone would shift from affectionate to inquisitive, then to suspicious. The fairy tale was glitching. The inevitable phone call from Karen came on a Thursday afternoon, a little over a week after I had sent the final email. I was sitting by my window, watching the rain streak down the glass when her name flashed on my screen. I let it ring for a long time before answering, just to listen to the sound. When I finally picked up, I said nothing. For a few seconds, all I could hear was her ragged breathing, a sound choked with a decade's worth of unshed tears. The rage was gone. The cold finality was gone. All that was left was a raw, unraveling panic. "Claire," she whispered. Her voice was thin and reedy, a ghost of its former self. "Claire, what did you do?" It was the question of a bewildered child, unable to comprehend why her perfect dollhouse was suddenly on fire. She didn't know the specifics, not yet, but she knew on some deep intuitive level that this was my architecture, the sudden chaos, the inexplicable freezing of their world, the silent, invisible force that was dismantling their lives. It had my signature all over it. "The bank," she stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "They've frozen everything. Greg's accounts, the board. They're talking about an audit. Lena lost the venue. Matt isn't calling her back. She won't stop crying." I listened to her litany of disasters, my expression unchanged. I felt nothing. No pity. No remorse. I was a doctor reading a chart, observing the predictable terminal progression of a disease. "It's all falling apart," she sobbed, her voice finally breaking completely. "Everything. Greg says. He says someone must have reported him. He doesn't understand who would do this. Why would someone do this to us? What did you do? Claire? Please just tell me what you did." I held the phone to my ear, the silence stretching between us. I could have told her everything. I could have explained the shell corporations, the tax fraud, the conflict of interest that had put my own career in jeopardy. I could have dredged up 20 years of slights and abuses, but that would have been an emotional response. It would have been a conversation. I wasn't interested in a conversation. I was interested in a diagnosis. I ended the call without a word. Then I opened up my messaging app, selected her contact, and typed a single sterile line. It was not an answer. It was a reference manual, a key to the code of their undoing. I wrote, "Check the tax code, section 7201. I hit send. Then I blocked her number. Along with Greg's and Lena's, the final piece of information had been delivered. The communication channel was now closed. They had the error code. Now they could sit there in the wreckage of their lives and look up exactly what it meant. They would find that it defined a felony punishable by fines up to $100,000 and imprisonment of up to 5 years. They would find that I hadn't just reported them. I had given the government the exact statute under which to prosecute them. I had handed them the rope, the tree, and the full legal justification for the hanging. The legal debriefing with my company's outside counsel took place in a sterile anonymous conference room in a downtown law office. The two lawyers, a man and a woman, were impeccably dressed and exuded an aura of expensive, dispassionate competence. They were not interested in the neighborhood drama. They were interested in risk, liability, and timelines. I presented the facts with the same clinical detachment I had used in my initial email. I explained how I came into possession of Greg's financial data, omitting the emotional context and framing it as a professional task I had been asked to perform. I detailed my discovery of the conflict of interest and the precise moment I had flagged it. They listened, their faces betraying nothing. When I was finished, the male lawyer, Mr. Crane, steepled his fingers. Ms. Danvers, your actions in reporting this were exemplary. You've protected the firm from what could have been a devastating blow. Now, one final question. Given your familiarity with Mr. Whitaker's operational methods, do you foresee any further actions he might take that could increase our clients or our firm's exposure? It was the opening I had anticipated. A cornered animal doesn't just surrender. It thrashes. And Greg's thrashing would be predictable. Mr. Whitaker is a man who believes he is smarter than the systems designed to contain him. I said, my voice even. The state's primary remedy in a tax fraud case of this magnitude is the seizure of assets to pay the outstanding liabilities and penalties. Logically, his next move would be to make those assets disappear. He will attempt a fraudulent conveyance to an offshore account. The woman, Ms. Albright, asked,
No, Irraplia.
He's not that sophisticated. He's emotional. He trusts blood more than he trusts banks. He will attempt to transfer his personal and board assets, property,
Vehicles.
liquid cash, into the name of his daughter, my neighbor Lena Whitaker. I saw a flicker of something in their eyes. I had just given them their next move. I was no longer just a whistleblower. I was a predictive analyst modeling the behavior of a hostile actor. I provided them with Lena's full legal name and date of birth. I would anticipate this action to be imminent if it has not been taken already. I concluded. Mr. Crane made a small note on a legal pad. The meeting was over. I knew they would act on the information. They had to. The possibility that their client's fund was now entangled with a secondary party actively engaged in obstructing a federal investigation was an unacceptable risk. A single confidential phone call from a firm of their stature to the lead investigator at the Department of Revenue would be all it took. The result of that phone call arrived in Lena's life 10 days later. She would have been deep in her new reality of a canceled wedding and a silent fiancé, likely spinning fantasies of how this was all a terrible misunderstanding that would soon be resolved. The arrival of a certified letter from the State Attorney General's office, followed by a formal summons delivered by a plainclothes officer, would have shattered that delusion permanently. She was not being invited to a deposition as a witness. She was being summoned for questioning as a person of interest in an ongoing criminal investigation. The investigators, tipped off and acting with speed, would have already seen the electronic traces of Greg's panicked asset transfers, a quitclaim deed on a piece of property, a large cash transfer from a board account to her personal savings account. In his desperation to save himself, Greg had done what I predicted. He had wrapped his crimes around his beloved daughter like a shroud. By accepting those assets, by signing those papers, Lena had made herself an accomplice. Her name was now legally and irrevocably tied to his. Her dream of marrying into the wealthy, respectable Harrison family was not just over. It was a laughable impossibility. She was no longer the blushing bride-to-be. She was the potential co-conspirator. The final message from Karen came through on a Tuesday night. I had blocked their numbers, but she must have used a friend's phone or perhaps bought a cheap burner phone for this one. Final transmission. It wasn't a call. It was a single long block of text. A digital scream typed with frantic, trembling thumbs. There was no punctuation, no capitalization, just a raw stream of consciousness riddled with typos and venom. You did this. You did this. It was you. All you. They came for her, Claire. They came for Lena. They gave her papers. She's a suspect. A suspect. Do you know what that means? Matt is gone. His family sent a lawyer letter. She's all alone. And it's your fault. You were always jealous, always bitter, poison in this neighborhood. We gave you a home and you burned it down around us. You think you're so smart with your computers and your rules, but you have no heart.
No soul.
Greg was a good man. He provided. He loved her and you killed him. You killed everything. We were happy with your words and your documents. He worked his whole life to build something for us. For her. And you took a screenshot and turned it into a weapon. You are not a neighbor. You are a snake. A murderer. You murdered this community with paper cuts. I hope you are happy now alone in your empty life with all your perfect data. You killed us. You killed your neighbor. You killed me. I read the message twice. My heart rate did not increase. My breathing remained steady. I analyzed the text as I would any other dataset. The syntax was degraded. The emotional state was one of complete systemic collapse. The accusations were illogical based on a corrupted understanding of cause and effect. Greg's crimes were the cause. This was the effect. I was not the saboteur. I was simply the audit log, the immutable record of their own actions. She called me a murderer. She was right in a way. I had murdered the lie they had all lived in for so long. I had executed the beautiful, glittering, fraudulent illusion they called a community. I deleted the message. Then I blocked the new number. The system was purged. The corrupted nodes were offline. The silence that followed was clean, perfect, and absolute. It was the sound of a job well done. The day of Greg's plea hearing was a crisp, colorless autumn morning. I chose to attend, not out of any lingering neighborly obligation, but for the same reason I review the final execution logs after a major system migration, to verify completion, to witness the final state change. I wore a simple dark gray suit, my hair pulled back in a severe knot. I was not there as Claire the resident. I was there as an auditor. The Hennepin County Government Center was a monument of concrete and glass, a place of impersonal bureaucratic power. I found the designated courtroom and slipped into a seat in the back row, an anonymous observer in a room half filled with other people's tragedies. A few minutes later, they were led in by their lawyer. The transformation was shocking. Greg, the man whose physical presence once seemed to consume all the space and oxygen in a room, had shrunk. His expensive suit hung on him. The shoulders slumped. His face, once perpetually flushed with self-satisfaction and cheap whiskey, was a pale doughy mask of terror. He looked not at the judge, not at his lawyer, but at the floor, as if the answers were written there in the scuff marks on the linoleum. Karen and Lena followed him. A pair of satellites knocked from their orbit. Karen looked a decade older. Her face a web of fine lines I'd never seen before. Her eyes darting around the room with a haunted expression. Lena was a ghost. Her pregnancy, once a source of radiant pride, was now just a cumbersome, awkward bulge under a cheap black dress. Her golden glow had been extinguished, replaced by a sullen, puffy resentment. They sat in the front row, a small, Miserable island of ruin. They never looked back. They didn't know I was there. The proceedings began. The charges were read aloud by the clerk. A litany of sterile legal terms that, in their cold precision, were more damning than any emotional outburst could ever be. Conspiracy to defraud the United States. Willful failure to collect or pay overtax. Fraud and false statements. Each charge was a nail in the coffin I had built. Greg's lawyer, a harried-looking public defender who clearly knew he was captaining a sinking ship, entered a plea of not guilty on all counts. A laughable, desperate formality. The real show began when the assistant U.S. attorney, a sharp, composed woman named M.S. Chen, stood to present the initial evidence to the judge to argue against bail. Your Honor, she began, her voice crisp and clear. The state's case is not based on speculation. It is based on a comprehensive and meticulously organized body of digital evidence provided to us by a whistleblower. She gestured to the large monitors mounted on the courtroom walls. And then my work appeared. There on public display was the file structure I had created, the clean folders, backdated fines, fraudulent invoices.
Shellcore.
She clicked open a spreadsheet. It was one of Greg's fine files, the one I had analyzed months ago. Here we have an assessment document for July of 2024, MS. Chun said, using a laser pointer to highlight a date. However, as the file's own metadata shows, and we have expert testimony to confirm this, the document itself was not created until September 16th, an act of retroactive fabrication designed to secure a board loan that was subsequently denied. She moved on. An invoice from Apex Lawn Services flashed on the screen. Its fake address listed below the logo. Apex Lawn Services, Your Honor, does not exist. It is a shell corporation, one of several created by the defendant for the sole purpose of laundering money and creating fraudulent business expenses to evade state and federal taxes. I watched dispassionately as my evidence became the narrative. The ghost in their machine was now testifying against them. I felt a quiet, profound satisfaction, not of revenge, but of seeing a complex system perform its function flawlessly. My data was clean. The logic was sound. The output was inevitable. I glanced at the front row. Karen had her hands over her face. Greg was shaking his head, pathetic, barely perceptible motion of denial. And Lena was not even watching the screens. She was staring down at her phone, her thumbs moving frantically. Her world had shrunk to that tiny illuminated rectangle. Then it happened. A sound. A choked, guttural sob escaped her lips. It was a sound of such raw primal despair that several people in the gallery turned to look. She stared at her phone, her face contorting in disbelief, then shattering into agony. She had just received the final status update. Her lawyer, a young woman who looked exhausted, leaned over and whispered frantically, trying to calm her down, but Lena was beyond reason. He didn't even tell me, she wailed, her voice cracking, rising in the quiet courtroom. It was loud enough for me to hear clearly from the back. His lawyer sent a text. A text. She stood up, turning to Karen, her face a mess of tears and mascara. Mom, Matt's parents served the papers 2 days ago. 2 days. The wedding is off. He canceled everything. He's gone. The scene was pure pathetic chaos. The judge banged his gavel, his face a mask of annoyance. Court officers moved toward them. Karen was trying to pull Lena back down into her seat, whispering, "Not here, Lena. Please, not here." But the dam had broken. All the self-pity, all the thwarted entitlement of a lifetime came pouring out in a flood of ugly public grief. Her spoiled princess fantasy had just collided with the brick wall of reality, and she was discovering that the wall did not care about her feelings. Greg didn't even turn around. He just sat there, collapsed star, his own gravity too immense to allow for any acknowledgement of his daughter's implosion. He was gone. They were all gone, lost in their own separate private hells. I had seen enough. The system had executed. The results were verified. I stood up. My movements were quiet, deliberate. I turned my back on the scene, on Lena's theatrical sobs, on Karen's frantic shushing, on Greg's catatonic stare, on the digital ghosts of my work still glowing on the courtroom screens. I walked toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room. As my hand touched the cool brass of the handle, I felt a final quiet click in my own mind, a connection being permanently severed, a process being terminated. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the hallway into the clean, quiet light. The door swung shut behind me, the sound of their lives vanishing with a soft, final thud. I did not look back. I would never look back. The wheels of justice, once they begin to grind, are exceptionally thorough. Greg's case never went to a full trial. Faced with the irrefutable, perfectly catalogued digital evidence I had provided, a case the prosecutor later described to the press as a forensic slam dunk, he was left with no leverage. His blustering denials evaporated in the face of metadata and encrypted logs. He took a plea deal. The sentence was 5 years in a minimum security federal prison, a number reduced in exchange for his full cooperation in identifying other board members in his circle who engaged in similar practices. He sang like a canary, turning on his old golfing buddies and poker partners to save a few years of his own life. The great provider, the board patriarch, sold everyone out to save himself. It was the most predictable move he could have made. Evergreen Estates HOA was declared bankrupt. Its assets were seized and liquidated in a fire sale to pay a fraction of the back taxes,
Fines.
and penalties levied by the state and the IRS. The operation he had built on the backs of unprotected residents and fraudulent invoices was dismantled and sold for parts. It ceased to exist, not with a bang, but with the quiet final stroke of a judge's pen. I saw the consequence for Karen about 6 months later. I was driving across town for a meeting, taking a route I usually avoided. When I passed the street on impulse, I turned down the familiar road and there it was, the house. A large for sale sign was hammered into the manicured lawn. A moving truck was parked in the driveway, its ramp down like a lolling tongue. 2 men were carrying out the ridiculously long oak dining table, the site of my final judgment. Karen had to sell the monument to her second life to cover the exorbitant legal fees and the personal liability from the bail bond she had signed for Greg. I watched for a moment as the house was hollowed out, its contents exposed to the indifferent light of day. I felt no triumph. I felt no sadness. I felt only the quiet hum of a process reaching its logical conclusion. The system was balancing its books. Lena's fate was a coda of its own making, a tragic and fitting postscript written in her own hand. After Matt's final brutal departure via his family's lawyer, and with the family finances frozen, she was left with a baby and no visible means of support. The Golden Princess was a pauper. So, she did the only thing she knew how to do. She lied. She applied for state-sponsored nutritional assistance and subsidized housing, claiming to be a single indigent mother with no income and no assets. On the forms, she conveniently failed to mention the hundreds of thousands of dollars in property and cash Greg had fraudulently transferred into her name, the very transfers that had made her a person of interest in his case. It was a clumsy, desperate fraud, and it was discovered almost immediately. The state's welfare system, cross-referencing her social security number with the ongoing investigation into her finances, flagged the discrepancy. She was charged with perjury and benefits fraud. In the eyes of the family court, a mother actively engaged in 2 separate criminal fraud cases was not deemed a stable or suitable guardian. Custody of her newborn son was granted to a distant, more stable cousin of hers from Karen's side of the family. Lena didn't lose her child because of me. She lost her child because even at rock bottom, Her first and only instinct was to cheat the system. My own story ended not in a courtroom or in front of a sold house, but in the quiet of my own home. I had been fully reinstated at my job. My name officially cleared of any wrongdoing by the internal investigation. In fact, I was a hero of sorts, the quiet architect who had saved the firm from a multimillion-dollar scandal. I never returned to the North Star account. It was reassigned and the fund itself was under intense scrutiny from the SEC because of the affair. A thick manila envelope arrived by courier one afternoon. It was from the firm's office of the general counsel. Inside there was no flowery prose, no emotional acknowledgement of the personal cost. It was a single sheet of heavy bond paper with the firm's letterhead embossed at the top. The letter was brief and to the point. It formally thanked me for my unwavering commitment to the firm's ethical and compliance standards. It noted that my proactive and principled actions were a model of employee conduct. It concluded by informing me that a significant bonus under the company's whistleblower protection and reward policy had been deposited into my account. I read the letter, then set it down on my desk. It was, in its own sterile corporate way, the only validation I had ever needed. I hadn't done it for them, but their acknowledgement was a final satisfying closing of the loop. I stood and walked to the large window of my house. Looking out over the Minneapolis skyline, the city lights were beginning to glitter in the twilight. A vast, complex and beautiful system, all humming along according to its own rules. My neighborhood was broken, their lives in ruins, scattered like corrupted files after a system crash. I knew they would spend the rest of their lives blaming me, casting me as the villain in their tragic story, the cold resident, the saboteur, the murderer of their happiness. Let them. I didn't need their absolution. I didn't need their understanding. I didn't need their forgiveness. Their opinions were irrelevant data points from a decommissioned server. I had spent a lifetime in their shadow, a ghost in their neighborhood, my existence defined by their narrative. Now I was free. I had my work. I had my integrity. I had the clean, quiet, beautiful piece of a system in perfect balance. And for the first time in my life, I had myself,